Alright champions, we've blown out to 3 episodes. I've just done some final touches on this one. I've lowered the amount of bypassing on the first stage to 2.2 microfarad. I don't think that's too far given the small cabinet. That changes the basically changes the higher pass cutoff of the first stage, so it just controls the bass a bit, so she overdrives a bit more gracefully when it's pushed into that state. Put a 470k grid stopper on the input of the phase inverter. Again, that just helps it break up a little bit more gracefully. You don't get quite the frequency doubling distortion that you get otherwise in the cathode ion phase inverter. Now what I'm doing is I'm a bit suspicious of the 400 volt rating of these caps. I know they've been there probably a very long time and they've been fine, but I just want to make sure they don't get smashed with a surge at startup when you first turn it on, because you've got the bias voltage minus 25-ish there, and you've got the plate voltage for the PI there. But when it's unloaded, the plate voltage for the PI will shoot up quite a bit. So let's just measure the two and we'll take the difference and figure it out. If I connect the ground to there, it's sort of loading it down too much and it's doing funny things to the bias. So we'll basically take 2 voltage measurements with reference to ground and then calculate the differential and see if it's getting a bit much of a peak for those two 400 volt caps there. The other ones are 400 volts, but they're with reference to ground, not with reference to the bias supply there, being a fixed bias output stage. Alright, so we're cold at the moment. We've got the plate voltage for the phase inverter on the left hand side, and we've got the bias supply on the right, so we'll click it on. Minus 20, we're shooting up to 370, 380, 385, and then we come down again. So we peaked at about 30 volts there, and so we're right on that 400 volt rating. So I think I might upgrade them to 630 volt just to be safe. I know they've been there a long time, but they're not original anyway, and it's just more peace of mind and more resilient in the long term. Alright, so before we go on, I'll just address a few questions in the first and second video comments. Why didn't I use a can cap? Because I've found the CE distribution ones terrible quality and very low voltage rating. They often turn up dead, or they last about 3 months and then fail, maybe a year and then fail. They're not reliable, so they're not an option for me anymore, and often the temperature rating's only 65 degrees Celsius or whatever, which is quite pathetic. These would routinely get longer than that, and they're only rated at like 1,000 hours, so they're just off my menu completely. Some people mentioned Hayseed Hamfest. What you got to bear in mind is I'm in Australia. If I'm ordering one capacitor, it could cost like $100 shipping and take weeks to get here, and they're very expensive for what they are anyway. Someone else asked why didn't I use radial caps. In this position, we'd have to go to some extent to stop vibrations. This is sort of a self-damping setup. If we mounted it against the chassis, we'd have to use silicon or something, which I don't really want a silicon to this thing. I'm trying to make everything reversible, and silicon you sort of can't get rid of every last trace of it. It sort of stays there forever and discolors the metal. The other thing that was suggested is I could put some foam tape there or something. That would still vibrate. Yeah, it wouldn't rattle against the chassis, but you could fracture your leads in that case, and I'm not really a fan of that with the tag strip construction. I did mention maybe in the future I might make a little daughter board that goes on 2 standoffs here that you can put some radials on and then run the wires to where they have to go. I don't see that being any worse than using radials in terms of, you know, vintage representation. We're just going to have to move on, champions. If you want to keep your amps running, there's going to be a point where originality is just not an option. Do you want to keep it running or do you not? You're going to have to ask yourself, and if you want to keep it running, you're going to have to use radials, in which case a small little board that can house, say, 4 radials, universal for this, and the deluxe reverb, Princeton reverb as well. That might be a cool little option, and just have some little nylon or brass standoffs that go into the existing holes there, so it would just sort of float about, I don't know, half an inch above the chassis, because the new caps are tiny. They'd easily fit, even with the PCB being slightly elevated there. So that's an option in the future. Another thing was, why don't you make the bias adjustable? You can stuff around mounting little pots and stuff to the board there, but nothing's really that elegant. It always looks kind of hodgepodge. The other option is remove the ground switch there and use that for a standard like 10k Fender style pot like you see on the deluxe reverb and the twin. I don't like having rear accessible bias adjustments, and then you've got post-it notes on the post-it. You've got like Dymo labels or whatever on the back, and it takes away from the aesthetics of the thing. At the moment, we're gonna have to put one for the voltage and frequency. Even though if we are in Australia, what are the chances of them plugging into anything else? And if they did, it would just run at half voltage. It probably wouldn't hurt anything. It would just be very anemic. I just don't like the idea of having rear accessible BIOS controls, because it's like that scene in Fifth Element. If there's a red button, is someone going to push it? Especially musicians, where they are very curious and somewhat uncontrollable creatures. And Gooden asked what the heater voltage is, and we're sitting at 6.5 volts AC, nice and stable, and about where we want to be. That's cool. What's half a volt here or there with the heater is acceptable within tolerance. If you're up around 7 point something volts, you probably want to start looking at, have I got the right transformer for my mains voltage, regardless of what's printed on it. Alright, so let's get this thing together and have a test with that WGS speaker. It's probably not my preferred driver for this circuit, but let's have a listen anyway, and if it's a little bit harsh, we might go with an ET10 instead, which I believe I've got one stashed away somewhere. The ET series from WGS is really, it's like putting cream on top of the amp. It smooths off all the spikes from the overdrive and just makes it like a big, nice warm scone with jam on top, you know? Well, Trabians, it's time to get onto the dirty cabinet. So before we even start cleaning, I'm going to remove the transformer. We've got 2 screws there on cable clamps, got 4 screws into the base, we've got a couple of staples holding that ground wire. So all of that will come out first. Might actually take the speaker out just to make sure there's no shmoo between the cone and the grill cloth. Just inspect the cone in general a bit closer, and the dust cap, make sure there's no issues there. Oh, how I love flat blade screws. Cut this ground lead for now. I'll flip her over and access the screws from the bottom. Got some old school dome headed screws there. Little bits of shmoo stuck in the slot from just rubbing against the ground. And we have Freedom Horrible Freedom. Wow, she's an old unit as well. Probably installed, well, not far off the vintage of the amp. So it might have been a really early acquisition to this country. Because yeah, it certainly looks, even the screw type, like everything's really old school, even on this installation. So that was probably done sometime in the 60s as well. Yeah, it'd be really interesting to know the detailed history on this thing. The amp, I mean, not the transformer. Well, that's pretty interesting too, but so not much we can do about the 4 holes in the cabinet without recovering it, and you probably could recover it. I think you might get some color differences in the new stuff. You'd probably tell that it wasn't matching exactly, but you know, it's in the bottom of the cabinet. Meh. And interestingly here, back in the day, they used to use a bit of like steel fly screen as a shielding device, and you know, staple to the top. It's actually not a bad idea, because when you use the thin aluminium, you can get issues with it rattling, whereas it's probably not as much of an issue with this stuff. What's a Brad's Guitar Garage repair without a few cockroach wings to vacuum up? Oh, is that a nail clipping? No, it's just a leaf. Alright, so it looks like these are just wood screws, so that's not fantastic. I was hoping they were T-nuts and machine screws. A little bit difficult to get them in now with grill cloth in place though, and I don't want to remove that. Not a fan of this. What I might do is get some threaded inserts into there and just use some machine screws. It's not with the vintage aesthetic, but I just don't trust wood screws into reamed out holes. Okay, this isn't good. I think I've done it to myself again. I always forget to check the speakers. I get so excited about doing the amp repair that I don't check the speaker or the reverb tank. And it's bit me in the ass many times, and it's bitten me in the ass again. I'm getting better, but this speaker is chooched. It's like it's pulled in, and it's got no bass frequencies to speak of. I know it's free air, but you can see it's sort of dished in, and it's very stiff. It's not seized, like there's still movement, but it's like it's sucked in for some reason. I don't know if something wrong with the spider, but point being, it's no good unless we recone it or something. So that's an additional cost that I did not estimate for, because I'm always too busy and rushed, and I always forget things like this, and it bites me in the ass. So now I've got to go groveling to the customer and say we've got to do something. Do we put a temporary, or do we put a replacement speaker in there, a modern equivalent, or do we send this thing off somewhere and get reconed? I don't think there's any reliable places for reconing in Australia at the moment. I've continually asking around. I've tried the speaker hospital in Concord, but they never get back to you. They're just not interested. So yeah, I don't know. I think I'll just put a WGS in there for now and have to talk to the customer about it later. Alright, so I'm going to go with the 10-inch Veteran on this one. It's a 8 ohm 20 watt thing. Similar cone design. I know it's ceramic, not Alnico like the stock one, but like I said, I'll give the customer an option to maybe chase a recone for the other one if we can find any contact that's worthwhile. Otherwise, we could look at maybe some 10-inch Alnicos that are a little bit closer to the original. Speakers are a little bit like capacitors in the respect that they kind of only last so long if they're not treated ideally. If you really baby them, they can last long term, but high humidity and stuff starts to break down the paper in the cone. And there's not a lot you can do about it other than a recone once that occurs. So the recone kits are pretty hard to find in Australia. It's probably the reason no one's doing them. And when you're shipping recone kits, you're shipping a lot of air, so they tend to be rather expensive to get even shipped out here. Like, you think about a large pallet, you can probably only fit 2 dozen recone kits on a pallet. It weighs nothing, but it takes a lot of space. So they tend to only be practical in the countries that they're manufactured in. Oh my god, champions, look at the joy of autofocus that works. Sorry, Painty Boy. The Sony boy's got it all over you. These are the threaded nuts, otherwise known as demon nuts. Threaded inserts, I should say. They're just steel. They've got a machine thread in the center and a big coarse thread on the outside, almost like a gyprock, what do you call it, wall mate over here. I doubt they're called wall mates overseas, but what I'll do is, because they've got to be drilled out to the shank size, so that's I think 9.5mm, 9mm, something like that. We've got to put something in underneath so it doesn't hit the grill cloth when we drill through. We'll get the vacuum onto it so we don't end up with sawdust everywhere. We'll drill and insert some of these, and we'll have some nice reliable machine threads despite the reamed out plywood. Oh, here we are. 9mm, silly me. 6mm. I was thinking about the metric 5mm ones that I was using the other day. Alright, so we've got 4 stainless steel fasteners in there, solid as a rock. One thing to be aware of when driving a stainless fastener into a steel or even another stainless fitting is you can have a thing called cold welding that occurs, where they literally weld themselves together with even moderate torque. Of course, it's a lesson you'll learn the hard way, but a little bit of this copper anti-seize, or these other brands and formulas and whatever, but just a tiny dab of that on the thread is enough to stop it from happening. Just any membrane between, even probably just a tiny dab of like bearing grease or something is enough to stop it from occurring. Alright, let's get this bad boy wired up and have a bit of a play, mate. Come over to the messy bench. Just give her a bit of a wash, try and get the ingrained dirt out of the Tolex. Bit of a scrubber dub. Alright, so one last thing to do is mount the handle. Not a huge fan of these handles, as I said, I think, in the first episode. I'd like to get DSL to make some handles. They're a guitar strap, primarily guitar strap manufacturer here in Sydney, and they've got some very nice leather samples that I think would look really good in this application. And one other thing I've realised is I do not have any screws for this, because I assumed that it had T-nuts for the handles. It's got a central nail, and then that works as the you know, in the strap slot there. But it's got 2 self-tapping timber screws that I don't have, because these are meant for T-nuts to be, or threaded inserts or T-nuts to be mounted from the other side, but this doesn't have any. So I'll have to get some, what do you call them, dome head, pan head stainless screws from the hardware. Probably have to pay $15,000 each for them. For anything dressy, that's the tax. But yeah, I've got to buy something like that in bulk. Nickel plated pan head screws, self-tappers, or 16mm long would be perfect. But we can do that at a later date. Let's just get this thing back together and do some samples. So next tedious subject, speaker plugs. There's the stock one. I thought that was a plastic on it before, but I think it appears to be a pressed metal. But yeah, it's getting pretty corroded. Looks like a zinc plating. The next option, what I normally use, is the amphenols, but it's not, shut up, motorbike. I don't think it's fitting with the aesthetic of the amp, so I think the next option, even though they're expensive, is the Switchcrafts. This is the Switchcraft 226s, my preferred one for vintage style amps. They're built like brick shithouses. I think they're solid brass, plated with nickel, and they're fantastic. Not cheap, mind you. They're about $13 each. Australian, that is, so that's like, what, 8 cents American. This is how I do it. So bit of heat shrink over it. I know, not cloth wire, but I didn't have anything that heavy gauge for the speaker stuff. The original stuff is pretty moldy and mildewy and gross. So we're just going with a new one. We've got some heat shrink over there just to protect the cables, the primary installation, from that crimp, and no need to crimp the hell out of it. It just sort of holds everything together. And nice and neat and tidy. And on goes the sheath. That's what it looks like. So it's still sort of got that vintage aesthetic, but much more sturdy than the original one. I'll just put a bit of paper towel in there to stop any flux from splattering on the cone, any solder splashes or anything like that. And there we have it. So here's the new suspiciously clean looking handle, but you know, it works. Got some new stainless screws on there, pan heads that I had to buy. The cabinet cleaned up rather well, just with a slightly damp rag. It is sealed with something. It looks like maybe one coat of shellac or something. So just a damp rag. We were allowed to get all the grime and spills and stuff off it, because it looked like there was some fluid spill inside this, probably from sitting drinks on top at some point. I don't know. The cabinet, the chassis looked really clean for that, but there were some fluid spills in the back here, so I'm not sure what happened there. But the speaker's nice and secure. We'll see what this one sounds like. Like I said, I'd probably prefer an ET10. These ones may be a little bit spiky sounding for a Fender circuit. Alright, we've got it all back together. All the missing screws replaced with proper cup washers, Fender style cup washers. And she's a lot lighter now, I'll tell you that much.